Well, joining me now to talk more about the economy and outlook is Jake Clopton, economist and president at Clopton Capital. Jake, thanks so much for joining from Chicago this morning. And what is on your radar when it comes to the economic outlook?
I think the big words are, inflation and also just keep an eye on the labor market. That's going to control, Fed policy and where they move rates. We've got some Fed speak, starting here a little bit later today. I really think that's going to be basically a copy paste of what he did at the House Services Committee speech on the 24th. They're saying that they are more than willing to just wait and see and wait for the data that comes in. They're really citing a lot of concern over, potential tariff spill off into like prices and into the rest of the economy. While at the same time, kind of keep an eye on what happens with the labor market for new policy in the new administration.
Yeah, the next Federal Reserve meeting, of course, coming here at the end of July. I think a lot of focus on
Right.
what the Fed is going to do when it comes to rates. How will the tariff deadline, which is due for next week, you think impact the Fed's decision here at the end of the month?
Well, it's a good question. I don't really think we're going to see much of an impact at the end of the month because the Fed is so data dependent and a lot of that stuff takes time to filter through the system. So I really think we're just going to have to wait and see what kind of impact, really happens from those tariffs. And if you get this contagion into like other parts of the economy and higher prices, I think we've seen through some of the PMI data, like Chicago PMI, that like a lot of firms were actually reporting, I think it was 70% of firms were actually reporting higher input costs. So some of those tariffs, I think, are starting to take effect, but if it starts to affect the overall economy and remains sticky, then you could see the Fed pause for longer to lower rates.
Yeah, we are expecting here any moment Fed Chair Jerome Powell to take the stage in Portugal to speak, of course, on an ECB panel for the European Central Bank. What do we need to hear from Powell to get a better sense as to the path forward?
I really think like his speech today is going to be very similar to the ones he's given in the past, especially the one to the House Service Committee on the 24th. He is going to give guidance to kind of say like, hey, we're willing to lower rates if that data comes in the right way. But again, he's just going to be data dependent. He's been very upfront that, and really said that, hey, we're going to be upfront that we're more than willing to wait and see what happens.
Yeah. So we'll wait to see what the Fed chair has to say. But of course, jobs data on the horizon as well. We know jobs is one of the major pillars of the Fed's dual mandate, the other being inflation. What do you anticipate from the JOLTS report and the jobs report this week?
Well, JOLTS, I'm anticipating coming in, pretty strong. It's May data, and it looked like, there was like some good jobs reports during that time. I really think that we're probably going to see another strong jobs report. I don't really see a reason why not to. A lot of like the jobless claims have, kind of been trending downward. So really could see, either basically in line with expectations or maybe a small beat.
Yeah, okay. I will be watching that closely. Of course, we've got the JOLTS data, we've got the private sector ADP report, and that non-farm payroll report early this week on a Thursday, since the market is closed on Friday for the 4th of July. Usually that does drop on the first Friday of every month. This data is so important, as we mentioned, as it does relate to the Fed. How is the consumer looking to you, Jake, knowing that the consumer does drive 70% of GDP here?
Yeah, I think the consumer is definitely an interesting, area to watch right now. And a lot of like what I'm looking at the consumer is kind of some of like the credit card pay now later debt and like some of like consumer loan defaults that are starting to creep up in autos and credit cards, stuff like that. That is definitely an area where we need to keep an eye on because it's kind of this, indicator of what's going to happen in the rest of the economy. But confidence seems okay. It's just a lot of these like loan defaults that I'm really keeping an eye on.
Okay, and how do you anticipate that could have an impact, the loan defaults that you referenced that you're watching?
It's just a barometer of consumer health. It's starting to look like there's a lot of debt burden out there in the economy, and perhaps people have a lot less disposable income. That's really going to show a lot of stress if we start to see that creep any higher.
Yeah, we'll be watching that closely. Corporate earnings season set to kick off in just a few weeks as well. Usually mid-July is when these companies start reporting results for the second quarter. What could these companies tell us about the state of the economy?
I think the biggest thing to watch in corporate earnings is any sort of like impact from tariffs and like squeezing of margin. We did see, if you take a look at the home builders, they're probably one of like the first ones that really have started to kind of squeeze margins because of what's going on with tariffs and like interest rates and all this stuff and health of the consumer. Right, we saw like in Lennar earnings that even though they beat on revenue, they didn't beat on profits because again the margins were squeezing. So I think that's one of the main things to watch is how what is the ability of these corporations to pass price increases and like input cost increases onto the consumer because the consumer's starting to look a little tapped out.
All right, Jake Clopton, economist and president at Clopton Capital. Thanks for joining us this morning from Chicago.
Thank you.